welcome everybody to what is our second seminar in our Friday seminar series here at the Middle East Centre at Oxford. Today we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Hussam Hussein, who's going to be talking about the politics of water scarcity in the case of Jordan. This is a seminar that's going to last for an hour. I think Hussam is going to speak for about 25 minutes or maybe half an hour. During the talk, you're very welcome to add questions into the chat. The chat will be monitored by Michael Willis, who's also joining us today. Let me just say a few words about Hussam, because as I'm sure many of you know, the theme of this term seminar is environmental politics in the Middle East and North Africa. And I think it's safe to say that we have got today with us probably the most preeminent scholar of environmental politics of the MENA here in Oxford. Hussam is currently a departmental lecturer in international relations in DPIR. He's also an Oxford Martin Fellow in water diplomacy. He's a member of the Middle East Centre, and he's the Fulford Junior Research Fellow at Somerville College. If any of you follow Hussam on Twitter, and I encourage you all to do so, you'll probably also know that he's just recently won several prizes. Has got several new affiliations to add to his already very significant and illustrious list. I know that Hussam has just been appointed as a fellow to the World Economic Forum. So really, Hussam is a very, very senior and serious scholar on this topic. Just browsing through his publication record, I felt very intimidated by the fact that he has already published 4 international peer-reviewed articles in 2021 alone, and published 9 in 2020, all looking at this kind of interface between the environment, politics, and questions of sustainability in the MENA region. Just an incredibly prolific and productive record, just enormously impressive. Otherwise, Hussam obtained his PhD in international development from UEA here in the UK. He's got numerous other affiliations. His fieldwork has been funded by really important institutions active in the region. I think we're really, really lucky to have him here with us today. Hussam, the floor is yours. I'm really looking forward to your talk. Thank you very much for coming and joining us.
Thank you very much, Neil, for this very kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And also, I'm very happy to see that, as Neil mentioned, the Middle East Centre decided to choose the environment as a theme for the seminar series of this term. I guess you can all see my presentation, so without further ado, I'll start. So the presentation today will discuss topics around the politics of water scarcity in the case of Jordan. The research problem that I focus on is Jordan's water scarcity. And I chose Jordan because it's said to be the second most water scarce country in the world. And the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, is the most water scarce region in the world. In addition to being the second most water scarce country in the world, Jordan has also several challenges, as we will see in today's presentation. Firstly, Jordan's groundwater resources are decreasing in terms of quantity and quality due to overuse and over-abstraction and extraction, especially in the northern part of the country. Over 35% of Jordan population is formed by refugees, as we will see also in a few slides. Over 90% of Jordan's food products are imported, and about 50% of Jordan's water supply goes to agriculture. So the water-food nexus is quite of an important issue, and we will discuss also this topic. These reasons are the reasons why I decided to investigate the Jordanian water sector, and in particular, the political economy of Jordan's water sector. And I used the discourse analysis and the discourse of water scarcity as an entry point to unpack and better understand the political economy of Jordan's water resources. This research, while obviously is contextualized in the literature of water politics and discourses of water scarcity and construction of scarcities, the main goal for me was to better understand the issue and the problem of water and water scarcity in Jordan in order to try to support and bring a change, a positive change a policy change towards more sustainable use of water resources in Jordan. So environmental degradation, which I already mentioned, groundwater resources and their over abstraction is rapidly increasing, resulting in a decrease of water quality and quantity, which is impacting all the users of water resources relying on aquifers. This means mainly small farmers and the farmers of the northern part of the country, of the highlands. And the other aspect that we need to consider is also not only groundwater resources, but also surface water resources, which are used, especially, I mean, we will mention them, the Jordan River and the Jordan River Basin, which has been over the years, the water of the Jordan River have been pumped out of the basin and also within the basin for especially agricultural use by all the riparian countries, or most of the riparian countries, in particular, I would say Syria, Jordan, and Israel. And this has resulted over the years in a decrease of the flow of the lower part, in particular of the Jordan River, by 97%. And this has also resulted in related issues such as a decrease of the biodiversity by 50%. And the Jordan River is the source of water that arrives to the Dead Sea, which has consequently decreased by about 1 meter per year. And overall, as you can see in this picture, in this slide, we have already lost 1/3 of the Dead Sea, of the surface of the Dead Sea. I mentioned earlier the transboundary water resources, which are key, especially in the Middle East and for Jordan, especially in the Middle East, because most of the water resources, transboundary water resources in the Middle East and North Africa are originated outside of the Arab region. And for Jordan are particularly important because 40% of the water resources are shared with neighboring countries. And therefore, given the water crisis of Jordan, obviously transboundary water resources, which are 40% of Jordan's water sources and supply, are very important. And therefore, the management and the governance of those water resources has been key over the years in the planning of strategies and policies for the Jordanian water sector. In particular, in this slide, we can see, a map of Jordan. We probably all know where Jordan is. But the interesting thing is that I highlighted the years in which the latest agreements with neighboring countries over the shared water resources have been signed. So we have in 1987, so the main water resources that are shared with neighboring countries in Jordan are the Yarmouk River in the northern part of the country, which is shared between, it's at the borderline to some extent, and is shared between Syria and Jordan, and then Jordan and Israel in the northwestern part of the country. And the Yarmouk River is one of the main tributaries of the Jordan River, and the Jordan River is the other transboundary river that Jordan has, which is shared with the Jordan River is shared between Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. But when it comes to the lower part of the Jordan River, we have Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. And finally, we have the DC aquifer, which is a groundwater resource, non-renewable, so non-fossil in technical terms, groundwater resource, which is shared between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. These three agreements that have been signed are important because they give clarity on how, and they provide details on how much water every country can use, and also some other details such as which kind of uses can these water resources be used. But in particular, the 1987 agreement between Jordan and Syria on the Yarmouk River is very interesting because it only discusses the Yarmouk River, and so the surface water resources, without including provisions on the groundwater resources, which are connected with the river. And therefore, what happened over the years was that Syria and Jordan kept attacking and accusing each other by saying that the other country was not respecting the agreement, and this was the reason, according to the different parties, why Jordan was not receiving the amount of water that Jordan would have expected from the Yarmouk River. But in reality, so while Jordan was accusing Syria, emphasizing the fact that Syria built many small dams and diverted part of the Yarmouk River, and these, according to the Jordanian officials, were the reasons why the flow of the Yarmouk River decreased. Syria instead emphasized that it was due to climate change and low precipitations rather than to those violations and construction of dams. But in reality, the latest research of a few years ago found that the main reason was that the treaty only discussed surface water resources without groundwater resources. And what Syria was doing was to use groundwater resources from the same basin, which decreased the flow of the river. The 1994 agreement instead between Jordan and Israel is on water is part of the peace treaty between the two countries. And so, I mean, it discussed both the surface water resources of the Yarmouk, of the Jordan River, but also of the Yarmouk River, and also had provisions on providing new types of water to Jordan. So not from fresh water, but not from the river, such as, for instance, from desalinization. But the issue was, I mean, one of the issues was the financial aspect of who will pay for producing these new water resources. Finally, the 2015 agreement between Saudi Arabia and Jordan is quite interesting because it's one of the very few agreements that we have in the world on shared groundwater resources. I think there are only probably 5 agreements. And it's interesting because it discussed the uses that these two countries can make of the groundwater resources of the DC. And they decided that the groundwater resources of the DC can only be used for domestic or industrial, domestic, but not for agriculture. And therefore, following the 2015 agreement, as we will see, large farms and agribusinesses that are based in the southern part of Jordan had to be closed by the Jordanian government in order to respect this agreement and also to make to shift and pump water from the southern part of the country to the northern part of the country, where most of the population lives in. So Amman is quite in the north, and Irbid, and that's where most of the population of Jordan lives. In this slide, we can see the water resources and how these water resources are used, which reflects what we were speaking about in the earlier slides. So we can see, firstly, that the water resources in 2017, which is the graph on the bottom left, shows that 59% of water resources in Jordan come from surface water resources. So from the 2 rivers that I mentioned, the Yarmouk and the Jordan River, as well as from the smaller Zarqa River. Instead, we have, and then we have about 29% that is groundwater resources, and then 14% treated wastewater, which has been increasing in the past decades. However, when we compare this with the sources of water supply, we can see that there's a bit of a mismatch, because we can see that most of the water resources that are being used for the water supply in Jordan are coming from groundwater resources, and only 33% from surface and 13% from treated wastewater. I mean, now 14%. But the interesting thing is that most of the water resources that are being used, the water supply comes from, groundwater. And the reason behind this is that, as we saw, most of the surface water resources are shared with neighboring countries. So there are treaties and agreements that regulate how much water Jordan can use. And therefore, it's easier politically for Jordan, given the increasing demand, as we will see, to ensure water security and provide water to all citizens by overusing and extracting the groundwater resources across the country. So not only from the DC, from the south, but also from the northern part of the country, resulting in a decrease in the quality and quantity of these aquifers. So in the short term, it's probably a solution, but in the long term, it's not sustainable, because these groundwater resources are gonna, I'm not saying disappear, but probably in 50, 70 years, this might be the case, that the quality and quantity of the groundwater resources in the northern part of the country in particular is going to be at a point that we will not be able to use them anymore. And that's more or less what also happened in the Azraq Basin, in the north eastern part of the country, where we used to have a large wetland linked with the aquifer. However, years of both local use for farms, but also pumping this water of the Azraq Basin to Amman, the growing Amman, resulted in the wetland almost disappeared. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I mean, if you go to Jordan, I really suggest you to go and visit the wetland, because it really shows you the level of the crisis, of the water crisis over the years, and particularly today in Jordan. And finally, it's very interesting to see how the water resources are used. So we can see that about 50%, 52%, about half of the water resources are used for domestic use, and this has been increasing in the past years in line with an increase in the population of Jordan. About 47, 8, 6, more or less, between 45 and 50% of water used in Jordan goes to agriculture. And only a very small percentage, about 3-4%, goes to industry and industrial sector. So keeping in mind that numbers and comparing them with this slide, I think it really shows and hints to the topic of today, the politics of water and allocations in Jordan. And we can see the role of agriculture in Jordan. From a GDP perspective is not very important, only 3%. Obviously, some people might disagree. I mean, there's different data and statistics on the role of agriculture in terms of GDP. And it really depends obviously on how we define agriculture and what we include in this percentage. Whether we also expand it to include the supply chain of the agricultural sector or not, which however would probably arrive to 15-20%. And also the labor force, same issue for labor force as we were mentioning for the GDP, but only a very small percentage of the population in Jordan is employed in the agricultural sector, only 3% more or less. And even more striking, probably, if we compare these numbers with the sentence on the right that says that Jordan imports more than 90% of the food consumed nationally, which means that most of the water, I mean, about half of the water in Jordan is used by farmers. However, the food that is produced is not really used for the national food security, but it's rather usually exported to the Gulf countries or to neighboring countries, or also to some European countries, benefiting only those that are obviously in the business of, especially large agribusinesses that produce these products for export. And from a water perspective, there is the concept of virtual water, which basically is the amount of water embedded in any product or service. So, and according to this concept of virtual water, many water professionals would argue that water scarce countries should try not to export virtual water, so not to export products and goods that are rich of water, which basically means that require a lot of water for their production, but instead should try to import this kind of products. And these kind of products are usually food products, meat in particular, but also vegetables such as tomatoes, but also fruits, bananas and watermelons, for instance, instead of producing them and then exporting them. So this would not make sense for the second most water scarce country in the world to export these kind of products. Instead, they should try to import them. Instead, it would make more sense to export products such as dates for or olives, because for their production, not much water is required. And also it's important to also look at what kind of water we are talking about. Is it groundwater resources, or is it an agriculture that is rain-fed? And therefore, so if it's rain-fed or surface water, and in the case of Jordan, as I emphasized, the problem is really in the groundwater resources, which are decreasing due to over-exploitation. And so we should probably rethink which kind of products we have in the agricultural sector, and who is benefiting, and which kind of water we are using for that product. And maybe also which kind of products would probably be better suited to be used and produced in the country. So the guiding question for unpacking the political economy of water scarcity in Jordan, for me, was how is the discourse of water scarcity constructed in the case of Jordan? So really a qualitative methodology trying to look at the written documentation on the topic, from media to governmental reports to national water strategies, policies, but also donors and international organizations report, the academic literature on water issues in Jordan, and then also textbooks, as we will mention later. This was combined with the semi-structured interviews to those producing this written material and documentation, but also to policymakers. And finally, observation of how people talk about these topics, and also focus groups. In this slide is basically the main findings. So what was the discourse of water scarcity that I found in Jordan? And what I found was that, while everyone agrees that there is water scarcity in Jordan, they disagreed on the nuances and on the causes behind this, the water scarcity crisis. So I found mainly two different groups. One is the dominant one, because it's the one that you would probably be exposed most to, like when it comes to mass media or textbooks or reports, and emphasize that there is a problem with water in Jordan due to water insufficiency. So we have limited water resources, and the main four reasons behind the limited water resources are, firstly, population growth, immigration, and refugees. So emphasizing here that while Jordan had a population of about 500,000 people in 1946, when it became independent, it then grew to 7 million in about 15 years ago, and today we have a population of about 11 million people. And so this increase of population obviously also means an increase in the demand of water resources, especially for domestic reasons. And the emphasis is often on the immigration and refugees. So it's not on the natural birth rate of the Jordanian people, but it emphasizes, for instance, the latest crisis in Syria that resulted in 2 or 3 million, depending on figures and numbers, obviously, of Syrian refugees. And before that, we had Lebanese, we had the Iraqis, Palestinians. So according to, and as we know, Jordan has been quite stable since the past decades, especially compared with the situation in the region. The other reasons are unfair sharing with neighboring countries. So depending on who you talk to, some people would emphasize that the agreements with neighboring countries on water resources were quite unfair to Jordan. Some people emphasizing the one with on the Yarmouk with Syria, others instead pointing to the one with Israel. And finally, climate change, so the nature and the environment. So on the one hand, climate change is an additional pressure. We are probably all aware of this challenge, as well as aridity and low precipitation. So we all know that Jordan is in the Middle East, and they perceive the Middle East as being quite of a desertic region, and Jordan is quite of a desertic region, and therefore it's quite natural and normal to have low to have water scarcity and low precipitation. So we will see that these, the people behind this water insufficiency narrative are mainly the governmental actors, and actors that are aligned with the government. So mainstream mass media, and also some academics, especially based in the country. Instead, we have also a smaller, like another narrative, which is a bit smaller because it's not as dominant as the other one, which I call the water mismanagement narrative or sub-discourse. And they basically argue that there is water scarcity and this is due to mismanagement. So if we simply had a better management of water resources, we would not have this situation. Emphasizing non-revenue water due to leakages and physical losses, non-revenue water due to illegal wells, illegal uses, and then sustainable agricultural water use, which I already hinted at earlier. And therefore here, the solution, for those actors is that we should simply better manage the water resources. And those actors are mainly environmental NGOs, donors, international organizations, diplomats, and some academics, both in the country, but especially based abroad. The solutions, these narratives are very important and very powerful because they are able to open and to lead towards certain solutions. So the water insufficiency one argues that we have limited water resources, population is growing, demand is growing, and therefore we need to increase the supply to meet and to match the growing demand. And the solutions that are mainly suggested, we will look at them in a second, are the infrastructural projects such as the Red Dead Canal and the Dead Sea Canal, or treated wastewater. Instead, we have the water mismanagement narrative that leads towards demand, so better management of water resources, and we need to decrease the demand. Decrease the demand through market-oriented solutions such as tariffing and removal of subsidies, more efficiency in agriculture, and non-revenue, so closing illegal wells and illegal campaigns. Finally, we have also conservation solutions, and we will look at them also in a second. So we maybe can go directly to this solution. So the Red Dead Canal, we probably heard of it. It has changed several times in its shape, but the main message of, the main idea behind this project is that Jordan, Israel, and Palestine would collaborate with a regional project to try to desalinize water in the Red Sea area in Aqaba, and then pump part of the brines and salt water to the Dead Sea, and then from the Dead Sea pump water to Amman. And the desalinized water in Aqaba would also go to Israel, and then Israel would sell water to the West Bank. The shape has changed, and currently the idea is that Jordan is going ahead with a Jordanian-only project, so desalinizing water in Aqaba and pumping this water to Amman and the north where Jordan needs most water. Another project that was, another shape that it had in the past was without the Dead Sea idea, was simply Jordan desalinizing water in Aqaba, giving this water, selling this water to Israel in the south where Israel needs most water, and then Israel selling water to the Palestinian, and also giving water from the north to Amman directly. There's different pros and cons, obviously. So potential benefits are new water for these countries, especially in the parts where they're more water scarce. Saving the Dead Sea, this especially in the beginning, even if probably to save the Dead Sea, they should just release more water from the lower Jordan River to the Dead Sea. And then peace and stronger regional ties, depending obviously on which lenses you have, this can be seen as a benefit or not, depending on who you are, but also challenges in terms of funding. It's very, pumping water across the country is very expensive. You need energy. Jordan is energy poor country. You need trust between countries, which is, which in the past years has not been there much, especially between Jordan and, I'm looking particularly at Jordan and Israel. And trust has, there's been many issues. We can discuss them later. Relying on neighboring countries for their own water security. Water obviously is a key sector, and relying on other countries is maybe challenging, especially if there's no trust. But the challenge here, and the balance is between water security or food security. So should Jordan use more water for domestic uses and less for food, and rely on other countries for food or not? The other project was the Dead Sea Canal. So Jordan, we mentioned earlier the agreement with Saudi Arabia, and they started in 2015-16 to pump water from the Dead Sea area to Amman and to the north. closing the agribusinesses in the south, which obviously, I mean, was a bit challenging, but we'll talk about this in a second. And then treated wastewater. This is something that which has been increased in the past decade, has been supported by everyone in Jordan in terms of the actors, the policy actors and the donors and the NGOs. The only ones probably were skeptic about this and still are not supportive are some farmers, especially in the Jordan Valley, because they're getting more treated wastewater. And the quality of the treated wastewater is obviously different than the one of fresh water that they used to receive, and therefore they are a bit concerned with the fact that their water is being pumped to Amman, and instead they're receiving treated wastewater. Non-revenue water has always been quite of a challenge. Former Minister Hussam al-Nasser, Minister of Water, tried to launch a campaign in order to close these the illegal wells. However, illegal wells are mainly in the north of the country, small farmers, and we will see this in a second. The role of farmers in Jordan is quite important. So it's not easy to go to the rural areas for the government and try to enforce the closure of illegal wells. This is quite an important slide because it looks at another solution on the demand side. Yeah, I mean, the previous slide focused on the non-revenue water, which, I mean, Jordan has been trying to work on, but has not really managed to successfully solve it. And this slide focuses on another type of demand side solution. So tariffing system, subsidies removal, and regulations on what type of crops we can have and farmers can have in the farms. And also this one is quite of another, it's another demand side solution that the Ministry of Water tried to implement, but it did not manage to. And this links back to the farmers again. So donors tried to push for subsidies removal since the 90s, especially US aid. And in 1997, they managed to have a water tariffs law, which decreased the quota. I mean, it was a quota system. So basically, the long story short, the goal of this law was to give only a free quota for a small amount of water for agricultural uses, and then all the quota above was charged quite expensively. However, while this law was approved in 1997, a few years later, there was huge opposition in the parliament in particular that resulted in an amendment of the of this water law, which basically changed completely the sense and the idea behind basically simply by increasing the quota to a very high amount, the free quota. And so this really shows that the farmers and the lobby behind the farmers is really powerful, and also in different ways, by protesting and opposing, but also in lobbying within the parliament in order to stop policies or laws in the legislative process. So this, I mean, the reasons behind, I mean, we are in the Middle East Center, so it's quite, we're probably all aware of the history of Jordan and the state making of the country, the history, and the role of the tribes, the role of tribes that have always been mainly present in the governorates and in the rural areas of Jordan. So, and that's where most of the agriculture takes place, and therefore there is a link between farmers and the role of farmers and the tribes which they belong to, and the presence of these tribes and which represents the farmers in the parliament, and therefore it's quite difficult for the ministry to go against the tribes and the farmers, because it's quite likely that they will oppose it and stop such reforms. And so basically, when it comes to reallocation from the agricultural sector to urban areas in terms of water, it has been easier for the government, instead of trying to close the wells in the north, or to change the tariffing system, or introduce regulations on the type of crops. It has been just easier to close 4 large agribusinesses in the southern part of the country, and to pump water from the DC to the northern part, to Amman and the northern part. Why? Because it was simply closing 4 large agribusinesses instead of closing hundreds and hundreds or thousands in northern Jordan. Conservation solutions, that's another way that has been supported by everyone, basically convincing and raising awareness on the importance of using less water. I published on this topic, examining in particular the role of textbooks, how the ministry used textbooks in order to raise awareness and change the behavior of the students and the younger generation in the country, but also initiatives such as Water Journalism Academy, so trying to involve mass media and journalists in changing the narratives, but also some projects on involving the religious leaders, so imams, for instance, in trying to highlight the importance of saving water also from a religious perspective in their weekly sermons on Fridays. So, I mean, some concluding questions for reflections and for discussion is, I mean, it's really important to look at what has been implemented and what has not been implemented, and why this has not. And also at the questions that we find ourselves in front, but also the government. So increasing the supply to meet the demand, or maintaining the status quo, and the challenges behind this, especially, I mean, the past decades of the so-called Arab Spring. I mean, it's even more challenging for an Arab government to go against important segments of the society. So challenges the status quo, redistribute or the water resources, or go instead for a sustainable use of water resources. Reallocation from the DC rather than from the highland, we already discussed this. And also, which interests do the different solutions undermine and challenge? What should the role of agriculture be in Jordan in the future? And how should Jordan balance water and food security, while also ensuring, I mean, that's something that it's very important, I'm mentioning it now for the first time, but agriculture in Jordan, the water that goes to agriculture is also important from a rural development perspective, and the jobs in the rural sector. And therefore, how can Jordan rethink itself and create new jobs in the rural sector and in the rural areas to ensure that farmers that might lose their job could, instead of going to increase the urban poverty in Amman, stay in the rural areas and work maybe in new sectors. And finally, what discourses and narratives will be needed to allow sustainable use of water resources, and also this shift of the economic paradigm of Jordan and of the water sector. So to conclude, we really need a holistic understanding of the problem in order to be able to solve it. We need interdisciplinary research to complex problems. So looking, for instance, at the water, energy, food nexus, but also rural development, jobs, and migration. And today probably was a bit of a different presentation coming from political science, but trying to bring together also geography, development studies, and but that's probably what we really need going forward. And then we need to contextualize water issues within the political economy, and also the regional politics, as I mentioned, the role of farmers, but also transboundary issues. And how should the Jordanian economy look like in the future, and how can we facilitate that transition towards a more sustainable Jordan, looking at different sectors. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any question the public might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Hussam. That was absolutely fascinating. I have a shopping list of questions that I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to abuse my chair's prerogative in a moment to do so. But before that, let me just remind everybody and encourage everyone to pose questions to Hussam through the Q&A function, if you could. I'm very conscious we've got 20 minutes left, and I'm taking Hussam out for dinner after this. So it might be that I won't get through all the shopping list now, but just very quickly, this is really, really thought-provoking stuff. Clearly, there's a kind of water diplomacy issue. I mean, you talked about transboundary water governance. Could you just say something very briefly about the situation in neighbouring countries? Because clearly this is going to have important implications for the incentives of those actors to participate in these schemes. And the kind of the stories, the accounts, for example, of water desalination that you give, it seems increasingly that Jordan is having to go it alone. In particular, just out of curiosity, I was really interested to hear how the conflict in Syria has implemented how the conflict in Syria has impacted water scarcity in Jordan. I was also curious, you obviously have done this really lovely, fascinating qualitative research where you identified these kind of two latent topics or two discourses, one around inevitable scarcity and one about management and trying to be more efficient and wastefulness. And I wondered, given the kind of really, this distribution of 50% of water is used by agriculture, and agriculture only produces 10% of food consumed in Jordan, I wondered, where does agribusiness sit in these two discourses? Are they suggesting that this is just inevitable, or are they trying to suggest ways in which this could become more sustainable through a more efficient use of water? And finally, this question about food security in Jordan, this is more of a comment than a question. This balance that you kind of constantly referring back to about food security versus water security. If 90% of food in Jordan is being imported, I would say that Jordan doesn't have food security by any normal measure. And I wonder whether that's kind of acknowledged, or whether this question of food security is actually just a discursive tool used by agribusiness to try to justify this disproportionate use of water given scarcity and lack of resources. I hope those are all cogent. If you want to answer those, or I think maybe Michael is organizing the questions. So I don't know, Michael, if you have preferences about how Hussam responds.
Yes, Neil, happy for Hussam to go over those questions, and we can come to the Q&A ones. And encouraging everybody, please do, if you do have a question, do type it, as Neil says, in the Q&A function. But Hussam.
Thank you, Neil, for your excellent questions. They're very broad questions, so I'm sure we will be discussing them later, but just to answer some of them. So situation in neighboring countries, from a water perspective, yeah, I mean, desalination obviously has changed the situation since the early 90s to today, especially in Israel, which has been using desalination a lot and has like the probably most advanced technologies when it comes to desalination. But this has not really changed the allocation between countries. And yeah, I mean, that could be also one of the reason why Jordan could try maybe in the future to rediscuss transboundary agreements, both with Israel, but especially with Syria. I mean, the situation in, as you mentioned, in Syria has changed in the past 10 years. The power relations between Jordan and Syria have changed. Syria used to be much more powerful in economically and also in other dimensions compared to Jordan. The situation now has been changing, and therefore I wonder whether Jordan will try in the future to sit at the table with the Syrians to renegotiate the agreements or to update the agreements on the Yarmouk River. That doesn't mean that Jordan will get more water, but it's just to better manage the water resources together. And the impact of the Syrian crisis on Jordan in terms of water scarcity, it has definitely negatively impacted Jordan, especially because Jordan had a very nice national water strategy that was approved, I think, in 2009, right before, I mean, a couple of years before. And in theory, in the DC project and the Red Dead Canal were projects that were going to save the water problem of Jordan for decades. However, what has happened was that Jordan had to accelerate on the DC Canal, and the DC Canal became just a coping mechanism to ensure water security for the northern part of the country and the refugees. So basically what has the impact of the Syrian crisis, I would say, has been mainly on transforming the long-term plans of Jordan in short-term plans, and having Jordan to have to rethink the sustainable the sustainability of the water sector and new long-term plans and new ways to achieve that. The agribusinesses, I mean, it's difficult to say, but overall, the tendency is that agribusinesses would strongly support and argue that there is water scarcity in Jordan due to limited water resources, due to refugees, due to either Israel or Syria, and due to climate change. And therefore, we just need to desalinize water. We need desalinized water from the south, which would not, I mean, keep untouched the current allocation of water resources, and therefore their benefits, at least the agribusinesses in the south. I haven't spoken with the ones in the north. I haven't spoken with the ones in the south, which I mean have been closed, at least most of them, and it's like a very politically sensitive topic. So it was very difficult to access these actors. And food security in Jordan. Yes, I mean, it really depends on how we define food security. I mean, food security, I mean, as long as Jordan manages to ensure food to all their citizens, I mean, all the people living in Jordan, then that's a way to ensure food security. Obviously, it's different than food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is when the food is locally produced. But the situation of food security of food security by relying on food imports is very similar to most of the countries in the region, if we think in particular on the GCC countries. But what some countries have been exploring in the GCC was buying, I mean, so-called land grabbing or investment of land in terms of in other continents and other parts of the world, especially, for instance, in some African countries such as Sudan. And so by buying land there and ensuring that the country has some agriculture, even if overseas, at least they can ensure that some food products will arrive safely and cheaply to their country. So yeah, I mean, it's really about I think political decisions that need to be envisioned of which kind of economy and we want to have, and on which sectors we want to from where we will ensure water resources and the food products for the people of the country. And that applies to obviously Jordan, but also to any country in the world.
Thank you very much, Hussam. We do have a question coming in from a very good friend of the centre, Matteo Lagrenzi. Now, if I'm not very much mistaken, Matteo's joining us from the beautiful city of Venice, which has a water problem, but I think a water problem of a rather different type than Jordan has, in having had rather too much of it. And very good to have you join us, as always, Matteo. And Matteo's question is an international relations question from an international relations person, he says. What would you say has been the impact of water, if any, in bilateral relations with Israel and its other neighbours? Is it actually a factor? Now, you've touched on that a bit. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, Hussam, about particularly the relationship with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lagrenzi, for this question. So, no, that's a very good question. And I would say that water resources are key, in fact, are in the bilateral relations with neighboring countries. In fact, the peace treaty itself of 1994 had an annex focusing only, Annex 2, if I'm not wrong, focusing only on water resources. And I would say that ensuring the stability of Jordan, and therefore ensuring water security for Jordan, is a priority for many countries in the region, also for geopolitical reasons. So ensuring, I mean, for Israel, it's a priority to ensure that Jordan will stay stable, and therefore will not run out of water, and therefore has been in the past decades supporting Jordan from a water perspective. And when Jordan requested additional water to Israel, this water was usually provided. And the reason behind is really that Israel, as we all know, has the longest border. I mean, its longest border is with, external border is with Jordan, and therefore ensuring that the eastern border is secure, and therefore also the security cooperation and stability of the neighboring country on the eastern side is really a priority for Jordan as well as for Saudi Arabia. So ensuring that from a Saudi Arabian perspective, the stability of Jordan has been key in the past decades. And therefore, this is why also the 2015 agreement came to be between Jordan and Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia had, and also if you look at foreign aid and funding coming from Saudi Arabia and also from the US, but like those are the two main partners that Jordan has had in terms of funding. And therefore, it really links with, foreign aid with water in order, and the main and geopolitical reason. So the geopolitical one is really the ensuring the stability of the Hashemite kingdom.
Thank you, Hussam. Another question from Lucy Banish, and Lucy asks, how important, and she puts it in inverted commas, is maintaining a certain degree of sovereignty, and the quote, in the area of water, food sovereignty to the Jordanian government. Is this a narrative that is coming up or not so much? So the degree of sovereignty in this.
Yes, very good question, and very current one, because this topic came up in the past years in Amman when the issue of energy and energy imports. We know that Jordan is very energy poor and therefore has been relying on other countries for their energy security. Currently, an extensive part of energy is imported also from Egypt, but also from Israel. And when the discussion on the gas deal with between Jordan and Israel, it was companies technically, but came up, one of the arguments and narratives was really this the one of whether can we rely on Israel, which many people in the public opinion in Jordan would not see as a reliable country or partner. And came up also when the issue of the Bakura a couple of years ago was discussed, and Jordan, so that's a small territory on the border between Jordan and Israel, technically Jordanian, but according to the 1994 agreements, the peace treaty, Jordan decided to rent it for a certain amount of years, if I'm not wrong, 25 years, to Israeli farmers, to Israel. Yes, this clause, however, also mentioned that then the two parties had to decide whether to renew it after 5 years or not, and Jordan decided not to, which was perceived and received not very well in Tel Aviv. And the reaction was a few months later from Netanyahu not to approve right away an additional amount of water that Jordan had requested. And therefore, that's when Jordan felt a bit water insecure, and discussions on whether could we rely on Israel for the Jordanian water security or other strategic sector came up in the public discourses and narratives, at least in conversations. So yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that every now and then come up, especially when it comes to water, food, and energy.
Great, thank you so much, Hussam. I think we've now answered all the questions, and this is perfect timing because we've now just about to reach 6 o'clock. So with that, let me thank you so much for coming and giving us such a stimulating talk about water scarcity in Jordan. It's a super important topic and a really good start to our series on environmental politics in the region. On that note, maybe I can also plug our talk next week with Jamie Furness from the University of Edinburgh, who will be talking about the blue-clad fennec, authoritarian environmentalism in Tunisia and its afterlives. I really hope that everyone in the chat can join us then. And with that, let me just thank Hussam again for his excellent talk, and thanks everybody for joining and for those really thoughtful questions. Thank you so much.